He was the type of bully every school seems to have, big, brazen, and believing he was the center of the universe just because he carried the last name Radcliffe, son of the principal. Blake didn't need to shout for others to fear him. The whole school had learned to bow their heads with every step he took. He taunted, insulted, and demeaned, never once encountering anyone daring enough to fight back. That was until the day he targeted the wrong person. Madison Carter, the quiet, reserved black girl, distant from others, with no desire to show off. A shadow Blake thought he could step on like all his other victims. But what he didn't know was that behind those calm eyes was a strength forged through iron discipline and a past no one dared to confront. Just 10 seconds after he grabbed the necklace around her neck, a keepsake from her aunt, a civil rights activist, Blake Radcliffe found himself sprawled on the floor, humiliated and in pain, realizing he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Ridgeway High School, nestled in one of the quietest suburbs of Virginia, with its rows of brilliant red maple trees in the fall, seemed like the perfect world of privilege. The school only accepted elite students, children of lawyers, doctors, politicians, and wealthy white families poised to inherit power. In this world, Madison Carter, a 16-year-old black girl, stood out like a misplaced dot on a perfectly drawn page. On her first day, dressed in a gray hoodie, old jeans, and a faded backpack, Madison stood quietly at the edge of the schoolyard. No one came up to talk to her. No one asked her how she was, but the stares were everywhere. It was as though her very presence was a mistake, as if her stepping through those gates had never been part of the script. In class, Madison didn't sit near anyone. She chose a desk by the window, taking out her notebook without being asked by the teacher. She didn't start conversations, nor did she respond when a few students muttered things like, "Probably got special treatment because of the race policy." But Madison didn't blush or lower her head. She simply remained silent, her eyes fixed on the view outside the window, where the autumn sky hung heavy with gray clouds. They called her the Shadow. Not because she was frightening, but because she didn't exist the way they were used to. No laughter, no greetings, no expensive perfume or new phones. Just a silence like a soundless wall that made them uncomfortable without understanding why. But there was one thing no one knew. Madison wasn't silent because of fear. Not because she was shy or insecure. She didn't speak because she was observing. From the corner of the west entrance hall, she memorized every face. The group of blonde girls with red lipstick always hanging out by the bathroom sinks, the jock boys laughing loudly during recess, and especially the tall guy with the crooked smile, the one everyone stepped aside for in the hallway, Blake Radcliffe. Madison observed closer than anyone thought. She wasn't looking for friends. She was looking for something else. Signs, subtle power dynamics, handshakes, and glances that only those who'd lived in the shadows of society could detect. She had grown up elsewhere. A place where people had to be careful when stepping out of their doors each morning, where a cop's stare could make your heart race, where every decision had consequences. And now, in this world wrapped in the sweet sugar of white privilege, Madison knew every piece was a pretense until someone tested its limits. She didn't need to break the order. She only needed to wait. Because in any system, there's always someone who thinks they're the lord of it. And when that person chooses the wrong victim, Madison wouldn't need to say a word. Her actions would speak for her. Because silence does not mean powerless. Silence could be the beginning of a storm. And Madison Carter, the only black girl among a sea of white, was the storm silently gathering strength. And, like an unwritten law in all hierarchical systems, Wherever there is someone isolated, there will always be someone holding power. In the world of Ridgeway High, where the spotlight always shines on those born to be admired, Blake Radcliffe's name is the perfect embodiment of power, arrogance, and the unspoken order that no textbook teaches but everyone instinctively understands. Blake didn't need an introduction. Every step he took down the hallway was a statement of his status. The son of Principal Thomas Radcliffe, who was once a famous football player, and now the symbol of conservatism within Ridgeway's educational system, Blake inherited not only his father's athletic build and sports genes, but also the pride and deep-rooted prejudices of a family accustomed to sitting at the top of the social pyramid. At 17, Blake was the captain of the football team, favored by teachers to an unbelievable extent, and regarded by his classmates as the untouchable. Standing over 6 feet tall, with a muscular physique, neatly trimmed blonde hair, and a smile that was just enough to make people either fall for him or fear him, Blake's real danger didn't lie in his body, but in the cunning intelligence he hid behind his flawless exterior. Blake knew how to control the space around him. He didn't shout. He didn't hit anyone in the hallway. Instead, he whispered sarcastic remarks in the ears of those he wanted to degrade, just when they were most vulnerable. He didn't block your way with violence. He simply stood in front of your locker, arms crossed, a smug smile on his lips. "Oh, you want to pass? I thought a top student like you could fly." His victims, from freshmen to transfer students, all experienced the same mental breakdown. No physical bruises, but over time they began avoiding eye contact, losing faith in the school, and retreating into themselves. This was the most subtle form of power, the kind that leaves no trace. No one dared to report Blake. Not because there was no evidence, but because the Radcliffe name had surrounded him with an impenetrable shield of prestige. Teachers didn't want to cross the principal. Friends didn't want to be ostracized. And those who had ever tried to resist, even with just one word, either transferred or endured hellish months in silence. Blake knew exactly what he was holding. He was the product of a system that allowed someone like him to exist, and more importantly, to be celebrated. His cleverness lay in never doing wrong enough to be punished, but always doing just enough for everyone to know he could do anything, and no one could stop him. To his close friends, who were also from powerful families, Blake was the leader without needing to campaign. They followed him like dogs chasing meat, always ready to laugh along with every degrading stunt he set up, just to remain in the position next to the one holding power. To teachers, Blake was the good athlete, well-behaved, with the face of a future leader. But to students like Madison Carter, those standing outside the circle of privilege, Blake was the living embodiment of every bias and system they would never be allowed to step into. Blake didn't like difference. He hated anything that didn't fit within the ecosystem he controlled. And so, when he first saw Madison, the quiet black girl walking down the hallway without looking away from his gaze, he didn't feel curiosity, he didn't feel pity, he only saw a challenge. In Blake's eyes, Madison was a glitch in his perfect world. A factor who refused to bow her head, who showed no fear, a trait he had never seen in any of his prey. And like all those who had lived in the illusion of invincibility, Blake began to feel an unsettling urge. Either make her bow down, or completely destroy that demeanor. What he didn't know, or didn't care to know, was that Madison was unlike anyone who had ever crossed his path. He only knew that, to preserve his position, she had to be broken. And from that very moment the game began. A game Blake thought he was controlling. But what he didn't realize was this: those who remain silent never play for fun. They only participate when they are ready to end everything. Blake Radcliffe never acted on impulse. He chose his targets like picking prey in a hunt, always starting from their weaknesses: fear, hesitation, or averted gazes. But Madison Carter didn't show any of those signs. She didn't shy away from him, nor did she display any challenge. She simply didn't care, and to Blake that was unacceptable. At first, he thought Madison was just another boarder who got into Ridgeway because of the diversity policy, which he had openly referred to as handing out scholarships to minorities. To Blake, students like Madison didn't belong here. She didn't wear designer clothes, didn't carry the latest iPhone, didn't post anything on social media, and most importantly, she didn't have a group of friends around her for support or integration. In Blake and his friends' eyes, silence was a sign of insecurity, and insecurity was an invitation. But this time, he didn't just see a misfit. He saw a black girl daring to exist in a space he had grown accustomed to ruling, and doing so completely independently. By the second week of Madison's enrollment, Blake had started to pay attention to her. At first, it was just a glance down the hallway, a few mocking comments when passing her with his group of friends. But he took note of the necklace she always wore, a worn silver chain with a small, flower-shaped pendant, handmade, slightly tarnished with age. It wasn't expensive jewelry, but Madison never took it off, not even during gym class. That intrigued Blake. One morning, as Madison was opening her locker, Blake and two of his friends, Sean and Tyler, stood a few steps away. Blake's voice rang out, deliberately loud. "An old piece of jewelry? Or an heirloom from your slave ancestors?" Sean laughed out loud, while Tyler pretended to frown, adding, "Looks like something dug up from a tomb." "Doing some archaeology today, Carter?" Madison heard clearly. She stood up straight, turned to close her locker, her eyes flicking over Blake just once, with no frown, no smile, and then walked away. To any bully, indifference is the greatest insult. And to Blake, who was used to seeing fear or pleading in people's eyes, that cold, dismissive attitude was like an invisible slap to his arrogance. "Who does this girl think she is?" he muttered. From that moment on, Madison was no longer the quiet black girl. She became a stain in the carefully ordered world of Blake's, and Blake decided to use his signature tactics to make her bow down. That afternoon, as school let out, Madison walked into the main hallway, only to be blocked by a group of students, including Blake and his friends. They were talking and laughing loudly, seemingly oblivious, but the gap between them grew smaller, until Madison had no choice but to stop, unable to pass without squeezing through. Blake looked up at her, holding a sports drink, a smug grin on his face. "Oh, Carter, we're waiting for instructions from you. How do they push through on the south side of Chicago, or do you have to fight first to get through?" A brief silence. Some students nearby turned around, a few stifled laughs, and others pretended to look at their phones. Madison didn't speak. She turned, walked down the back hallway, and continued as though nothing had happened. Blake watched her, licking his lower lip, a habit when he felt he had the upper hand, but he saw nothing in Madison's eyes. No anger, no fear, no reaction he could use. So, he upped the stakes. The following Monday morning, Blake snuck into class early, before the bell rang. He flipped through Madison's notebook left on the desk, browsing a few pages. Inside were meticulously drawn sketches. Faces of black women, proud eyes, braided hair, headscarves, dreams, and even anger. He snickered, tore out a page, and stuck it on the whiteboard, scribbling a crude message beneath it. "Wakanda forever. Princess goes to class." When Madison entered, the whole class turned to look at the board. A few laughed, some stayed quiet, but all eyes were on her, waiting for a reaction. Madison glanced at the board, at the drawing of herself, then quietly walked over, took the paper down, folded it neatly, and put it in her pocket. She returned to her seat, saying nothing. She didn't show hurt, she didn't show contempt. She was like a still pond, so calm it was almost uncomfortable, and it was that stillness that drove Blake mad. "Does she think she's better than us?" he asked Sean at lunch that day. "Cold as ice, like we're the clowns." "Maybe she's a robot," Sean joked. "Or a person trained by the Black Revolutionary Army." Blake didn't laugh. In his mind, one question began to repeat itself. Why isn't she reacting? He had made a sophomore cry in class. He had forced a teacher to take a leave due to pressure from parents after he deliberately filmed and spread rumors. He had threatened a classmate by exposing their personal secret just to land the lead role in the school play. And now, he was facing a girl who wasn't weak, who wasn't fighting back, but also wasn't yielding. And that wounded his ego more than any insult could. What Blake didn't realize was that he was being led. That in the game he thought he was controlling, Madison was the one in charge. Because Madison knew that people like Blake couldn't exist without an audience. They thrived on reactions, on the fear they instilled. And if you didn't respond, they would spiral into madness. What Madison didn't say, but knew quietly, was that Blake was getting closer to crossing a line he should never cross. And when he stepped over that boundary, her silence wouldn't be a shield anymore. It would be a sword. And when that sword was drawn, she wouldn't need a single threat. Because true retaliation always comes in silence and ends in the shock of someone who never thought they could lose. And in Blake Radcliffe's eyes, that indifference was not just a silent slap, but the greatest challenge his domineering ego had ever faced. But what frustrated him even more was that Madison Carter didn't do anything to retaliate, to shout, to cry, or even just look at him with anger. Nothing. Not a sigh, not a sign of weakness. And that, in Blake's eyes, was the clearest sign of weakness. At Ridgeway, where all power was built on fear and control, silence, if not accompanied by submission, was viewed as contempt. And contempt to Blake was unforgivable, especially when it came from a black girl with no name, no power, no protection, and above all, daring to walk past him as though he didn't exist. So he decided to start his usual tests that had worked on many weaker individuals before. Intentional bumps in the narrow hallway, standing in front of her locker at the exact moment Madison approached, forcing her to wait or turn around. Light nudges to make her books fall to the floor, followed by a feigned shrug. "Oops, I didn't see you. Maybe it's because your skin is too dark." The students around them laughed, not because it was actually funny, but because they had learned that at Ridgeway, laughing along with Blake Radcliffe was a way to survive. A few hesitant glances were cast toward Madison before quickly being averted, as though looking too long might make them the next target. And Madison still silently bent down to pick up her books. She didn't respond, not hurriedly, not awkwardly. She simply acted as if nothing had happened, as if Blake Radcliffe were a light breeze passing through her life, not worth paying attention to. That attitude didn't please Blake. On the contrary, it irritated him to the point of suffocation. The bumps, the mocking words. He expected at least a change in Madison's attitude. She should bow her head, avoid him, or get angry. But no. She didn't react, and that felt like a blunt knife cutting into Blake's fragile ego, an absolute rejection of his power. "Who does she think she is?" he muttered in the locker room after football practice. A black girl with no name, no status, doesn't greet anyone, doesn't bow down, and doesn't apologize when she dares to walk past me? Tyler, his closest teammate, sneered, "Maybe she's mute." Blake scoffed, but a dark flicker appeared in his eyes. "No, she talks enough for me to hear, and I swear, I'll make her kneel and say, 'Please.'" In the days that followed, the hallways of the school became the stage for an invisible play, with Blake as the director and Madison as the lead character, who wasn't following the script. She was blocked in the hallways as she changed classes. Her locker was suddenly filled with crumpled papers and empty water bottles. Once, someone intentionally spilled coffee on her coat when she hung it on the hook outside the classroom. Everything unfolded like a strange series of coincidences. No one was caught, no one was blamed, but Madison knew exactly who was behind it. And still, she didn't react, didn't report it, didn't tell the teacher, didn't even ask anyone. Why? To others, her silence seemed like weakness. But inside Blake, a vague unease began to form, because he knew, of all the people he had ever bullied, none were like Madison. She wasn't scared, and she didn't need to pretend to be strong. She simply didn't give him any emotions to manipulate. One late afternoon, Blake followed Madison all the way to the bike rack. He walked closely behind her, just near enough to hear her steady footsteps, neither fast nor slow. When she stopped to unlock her bike, he spoke, his voice just loud enough to be heard. "Your mom must have taught you not to talk back to white men, right? Or is it illegal to talk to Ridgeway people in your neighborhood?" Madison didn't turn her head, didn't look at him. She just fastened her helmet, sat on the bike, and softly said, not cold, not harsh, just a simple declaration, "Try crossing the line." Then she pedaled away, leaving Blake standing alone in the empty parking lot. No one was watching. No one was laughing along. And for the first time, a nameless emotion began to stir within him. Not fear, but an unfamiliar feeling he wasn't used to, no longer in control of the situation he created. From that day on, Blake no longer saw Madison as a black girl to be shaped, but as an enigma, a person who didn't follow the rules, a silent threat that was shaking the world he had once controlled completely. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what she had been through. But he knew one thing. If he didn't make her submit soon, he himself would begin to lose everything he had once considered invulnerable. And so, Blake decided to stop playing around. The game was over. From now on, he would take real action, and Madison Carter would have to kneel. But what he didn't know was that this decision would mark the beginning of an irreversible downfall, because Madison, the silent black girl he always thought was weak, was not prey. She was the challenge, the conclusion, the storm that was coming, and Blake, with all his pride, was not prepared to face it. And just like the instinct of every arrogant person about to face failure, Blake Radcliffe had no idea that he was gradually stepping closer to a boundary that he could not cross without self-destruction. He thought Madison Carter was an easy psychological project. Humiliate her, apply pressure, and force her to break. But what he didn't know was that the nudges, the sarcastic remarks, and the contempt he tried to impose on her every step were nothing more than the wind brushing against a steel wall forged in the fires of a past she had never revealed. Because Madison, though silent, was never a weak girl. Before coming to Ridgeway, Madison had spent the first 15 years of her life in South Chicago, a place where the sound of police sirens was a lullaby, where alleyways were the borders between surviving and dying, where every child learned to observe their surroundings before stepping outside. It was a world where the law was not applied equally, where skin color was not just an identifier. It was a default sentence in the eyes of others. In that world, Madison was not just a black girl. She was the daughter of Jerome Carter, a former U.S. Marine Force recon who once led close-quarters assault teams in the Middle East, and after retiring, became a hand-to-hand combat trainer for Homeland Security. Jerome was the model of discipline the fortress, the family, and the neighborhood leaned on whenever things went awry. He did not pamper Madison. He didn't give her time to daydream. He didn't teach her how to handle bullying with words or tears. He taught her how to stand tall, keep her breath steady, shift her weight, and finish every conflict with a single blow. Precise, decisive, unforgiving. When Madison was 8 years old, she was given gloves and stepped onto the training floor with her father. While other children were learning ballet or piano, she learned how to lower her center of gravity when attacked unexpectedly, how to use her elbows to break a hold, how to neutralize someone twice her size in 3 seconds. Each training session ended with Jerome's question, "When are you allowed to use this?" And the answer was always, "When there is no other choice." Madison memorized that lesson, not because she feared her father, but because she understood. True strength lies in knowing when to use it and when to hold it back. At 12 years old, Madison was forced to apply her lessons outside of the training floor for the first time. An older boy, tall, loud, was bullying her younger brother right in front of the schoolyard, pushing him into the brick wall and calling him scum. When Madison approached, the boy turned around and swung his fist. "You want to protect your brother? Like those uneducated black single moms?" She didn't shout. She didn't warn him. In just 1 second, he was on the ground, his right arm twisted behind him at an unnatural angle. His scream echoed through the yard, and along with his scream came the gazes of everyone around, not in surprise, but in fear. But what Madison remembered most was the look from the teacher, who didn't ask her why she did it, but just yelled, "Call security, there's a student attacking with violence." No one cared that her brother had been bullied first. No one asked what the other boy had said. What they saw, and locked in their minds as an indictment, was a black girl daring to strike a white student. From that day on, Madison was suspended for a week. At the school board meeting, she was labeled as a dangerous student, a threat to the school environment. A local newspaper reported, "School violence, female student breaks classmate's arm." No one mentioned the cause, no one mentioned race. But Madison understood. Very well, she would never be allowed to retaliate again, unless she wanted the world to immediately label her with words like savage, acting like an animal, violent tendencies. Because when a white child got angry, it was called academic pressure. But when a black girl fought back, they called it a potential threat. And from that day on, Madison made herself a promise. She would not strike back. Not when humiliated, not when provoked, not even when pushed to the edge of the abyss. Unless the other person crossed the final line. Because she knew well, once that boundary was crossed, there would be no mercy. No apology would be enough. No way to retreat. Ridgeway was a completely different world, but the discrimination, whether wrapped in humor or a fake, kind look, was still the same. Blake Radcliffe, with all his privileges and arrogance, had no idea that he was poking at a scar that had never healed, awakening a beast Madison had long confined in her heart, held tightly with all her willpower and reason. And ironically, the more he pushed Madison into a corner, the more he made that beast stir, rise, and smell the blood of a fake predator. Madison wasn't afraid of him. She was just keeping a promise to herself. But every promise, whether sworn under the moonlight or through tears, has its limits. And Blake was getting too close. And as if all boundaries were mere jokes in the eyes of those accustomed to privilege, Blake Radcliffe finally took a step too far, crossing a line he should have never crossed. That afternoon, the hallway of Building E was quieter than usual. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting long golden streaks across the cold tile floor. The classes had ended, and students began to disperse, heading home. But in the West Wing, the part of the hallway where Madison often paused to adjust her books before leaving for the day, there was no one except Blake. He waited there for her, hands stuffed in his pockets, his back casually leaning against a locker. The soft light illuminated his sharp jawline and his familiar crooked smile, the smile that the girls in school had once described as dangerously seductive. But today it was cold, like the edge of a blade. Madison walked toward him, as quietly as ever, her arms holding a few thick books and her sketchbook. She saw him, paused for a brief moment, then continued walking, her expression unchanged. "Not going to say hello?" Blake's voice rang out, light but filled with implication. He stepped away from the locker, moving toward her slowly, deliberately, with purpose. Madison didn't respond. She turned to open her locker, taking out her books, as if his presence didn't matter. Blake stepped up behind her, his breath grazing her neck as he spoke again, this time quieter, closer. "Nice jewelry. Let me hold on to it for a few days." Without waiting for her consent, his hand jerked at the thin silver chain that lay around Madison's neck. It was a simple piece of jewelry, a silver pendant shaped like a hand gripping a small flower, engraved with the initials R.L.C. Her grandmother's name, Ruby L. Carter, one of the black women who pioneered the anti-school violence movement in Chicago in 1963. The necklace was a memory, flesh and blood, a symbol. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was the only heirloom left in her home after her grandmother passed, and the only thing Madison had never allowed anyone to touch since receiving it at her grandmother's funeral when she was 12. And now it was in Blake's hand, after a harsh, cold tug that lacked thought, even cruelty. The chain snapped and the pendant fell, lightly clinking against his palm, the sound ringing out like a cut through the air. Madison didn't scream. She didn't yank it back, but her entire body froze for a moment, brief enough to blend with the distant sound of footsteps down the hallway. Slowly, she turned, her gaze no longer avoiding him as it usually did. For the first time, her eyes met Blake's, and for a moment, he was taken aback. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger. It was the coldness in her stare, the terrifying calm he had never seen from anyone in his life. "Give it back," Madison said, her voice not loud, not shaky, but every word clear. Blake laughed, gripping the pendant tightly in his hand, stepping back half a step as if to challenge her. "Who do you think you are? Ridgway's invisible black girl asking for her stuff back? Say please, then I'll consider it." Madison took a step toward him. The sunlight filtered through the windows, casting shadows on her cheekbones, accentuating the steady resolve of someone who wouldn't tolerate another second. "I said, give it back." Blake scoffed, raising the pendant to eye level as though holding up a trophy. "An antique? What's it mean? Or are you planning to use it to summon Malcolm X's ghost to save you?" In that instant, he didn't realize Madison was no longer in the cowering posture she had always maintained. She wasn't clutching her books, she wasn't turning away, she wasn't yielding. Her shoulders were square, her eyes wide open, feet firmly planted on the cold tile, and her hand was about to move. And then, everything happened in less than a second. A sharp crack echoed, not a punch, but the sound of Madison's arm locking Blake's wrist, twisting it in the opposite direction, causing his joints to pop. Before he could shout, she drove her knee into his, sending him stumbling backward. The book in her hand dropped, but she didn't care. Her other hand grabbed his collar, and like a skilled judoka, she shifted her weight, lowered her center of gravity, and threw him down onto the cold floor. The sound of his body hitting the hallway floor reverberated. Silence. Blake lay there, stunned, panicked, unable to process what had just happened. His wrist ached, his mind was disoriented. The pendant still lay in his hand, but it trembled. Madison bent down, placing her knee on his arm, locking him in a position no one had ever seen in school, except those who had been in the military. "This is the last time you touch anything that belongs to me," she said, her voice calm and low. "I've let you off for a long time because I thought you were just a child who needed to be taught. But you're not a child, Radcliffe. You're the problem, and problems need to be dealt with." She pried his hand open, took the pendant back, and stood up. No curses, no threats, just silence. Blake lay there, choking, his heart pounding like a drum, his pride shattered. He had just been taken down by a black girl he had once considered the lowest on the social food chain. No one witnessed it. But from that moment on, he knew. Everything had changed. And the worst part? It wasn't being taken down, it was the certainty that she could have done so much more. But she didn't, and that forgiveness, it wasn't kindness, it was a clear message. I'm in control, not you. And as Madison stood up, the pendant resting in her palm like a piece of her soul reclaimed, everything around her seemed to sink into silence. The hallway, typically buzzing with noise, suddenly felt hollow, as if every footstep, every word, every laugh was choked by the abrupt, illogical shift in the world it once functioned within. The order had been challenged, and the challenger was not a stranger, but the girl the whole school had learned to ignore. Madison didn't take her eyes off Blake, still sitting on the cold floor, his cheek slightly swollen, one wrist red from being twisted. The chaos in his eyes wasn't from pain, but from shock. He couldn't understand, or didn't want to believe, that he, the one once seen as the law of Ridgeway, had been defeated, thrown down like an unimportant novice. And what frightened him even more was Madison's gaze. It didn't sparkle with triumph. It didn't burn with anger. It didn't carry a shred of satisfaction from getting revenge. In her eyes there was only calculation. It was the look of someone who had carefully considered when to strike, who had weighed the consequences, and in the end decided that now was the right moment to end the game. At the far end of the hallway, a group of students who had been walking by paused. Among them were a few football players, the ones who always walked with Blake like a personal entourage. One, Miles, a defensive linebacker, furrowed his brow at the scene before him and whispered to the person beside him, "What's she going to do now? Cry?" But before the whisper could travel further, Madison turned her head and glanced back. That single glance was enough to choke off every word. She didn't need to shout, swing her hands, or yell. Her stare, calm to the point of terror, was a silent declaration. "I've let you all go long enough." She bent down, picked up the fallen sketchbook at her feet, folded it, and slipped it into her bag. Her movements were slow, steady, as if she had just finished a boring class, not just taking down the king of the hallway. Blake struggled to stand. His back ached, his legs wobbled, and he had to lean on a locker to stay upright. Dust from the floor clung to his hands, and his fingers trembled lightly. Not from physical injury, but from the shock to his pride. He opened his mouth, ready to say something, to regain the control he was used to through mockery, through insults that had made so many others bow their heads. But he couldn't. In that hallway, under the eyes of students who had not yet left, he stood alone, a leader who had been knocked down with no one coming to help. And Madison, the one who had just brought him down, stood there silent. Nothing was more terrifying than a strong person who didn't need to say anything and still made everything change. In that moment, Blake's survival instinct, the one he had once mocked when seeing it in others, rose up. He understood. If he continued to challenge Madison, if he kept trying to reclaim his position with empty words, next time she wouldn't show mercy. Because even though he couldn't admit it aloud, he felt it in every cell of his body tightening under his skin. Madison Carter hadn't used even half of her strength. She had spared him. But that forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was power, a kind of power Blake had never faced in all his years of living in protection, arrogance, and privilege. The power of someone who controls their fury, someone who knows they could destroy but chooses not to. The hallway began to buzz again. A few students whispered, their phones already out, likely recording the final part of the confrontation. News spread like wildfire. In less than an hour, from private messaging groups to virtual bulletin boards, the name Madison Carter began to appear, no longer as the quiet black girl, but as the one who took down Blake Radcliffe. And what made everything more confusing and captivating to Ridgeway students was no one knew who Madison really was. She didn't play sports. She didn't participate in extracurricular activities. She didn't post anything on social media. She had no close friends to confide in. She just came to school, learned, observed, and waited. It wasn't until today, when she walked past the temporarily defeated Blake Radcliffe without looking back, that people began to ask, who is she, really? For Blake, that question came too late. Because he had already touched something he shouldn't have. And he knew, deep in his soul, that from this day forward, every step he took in Ridgeway would no longer be with pride, but with stealth, with fear, and the bitterest part, he would have no one to blame but himself. And in the span of just 10 seconds, 10 brief seconds, but enough to upend the entire power structure at Ridgeway, Blake Radcliffe found himself facing the longest moment of his life, as every control tactic, every dominance game he had ever used, fell apart before a single, unannounced act, without fanfare, without warning, and without leaving any room for retaliation. Just a moment before, he had been the one in control, the one with the upper hand. He had smiled, the trademark smile he always wore before delivering his next humiliating blow to those he considered weak. But before his arm could fall, before his smile could fully stretch, his right wrist was already twisted so tightly that he could no longer feel it. Madison didn't take a step back. She didn't scream. She didn't throw a punch like in action movies. It was simply a smooth, precise movement, as though everything had been planned in advance. Her arm twisted his wrist in a direction that wasn't natural, causing the joint to snap with a sound that choked up in Blake's throat. As his body instinctively stiffened, Madison's foot swept across his leg, knocking out his center of gravity. In the blink of an eye, the man who had once towered over others by a whole head was now crashing down onto the cold tile floor, his broad back slamming against the hard surface. The sound of impact rang out sharply. A few students nearby scrambled back in panic. The silence that followed was not just confusion. It carried a sense of vertigo, as though they had just witnessed an irreversible event. A topple that happened before their eyes, without announcement, without justification. Blake hadn't had time to yell. He hadn't had time to process it. The pain in his back was secondary. What overwhelmed him was the shock, like a tower had just collapsed, not from a wrecking ball, but from a single touch in the right spot. Then Madison knelt, her left knee pressing against his shoulder, her hand sliding under his arm, twisting his lock behind his back. Each movement was precise, every finger tight with the pressure. Her breath remained steady, her cheek flushed with the light of the fading day, but her eyes, the one thing that remained unchanged, were sharp, focused, and indifferent. Blake felt the weight not from her body, but from the determination in how she held him. She didn't look at him like an enemy, but like a target that needed to be neutralized. No anger, no triumph, just a task that needed completing. And then, as if delivering a verdict from someone who held the scales of justice without the need for a robe, Madison leaned close to his ear and whispered, "I told you, don't touch me." Her words, soft as the wind, felt heavier to Blake than any punch he had ever taken on the field. They cut through every psychological defense, every concept of power he had ever known. He wanted to respond, to throw out some sarcastic remark like always, to reclaim the last shred of his pride, but his throat was dry, and no words came. "Let go of me," he hissed through gritted teeth. Madison didn't tighten her grip. She didn't need to. The stability of the hold alone was enough to prevent him from fighting back. She leaned in slightly more, her breath brushing his ear, her voice calm as if reciting a poem. "Say, please." Blake blinked. That simple request felt like a strike to the heart of his identity, the one who always made others beg, plead, kneel. Now, he was the one who was forced to say it, and not to a stronger man, but to a black girl he had once considered invisible. Are you crazy?" He tried to muster, struggling like an animal in chains. Madison didn't respond. She didn't move, only leaned a bit closer, whispering almost too softly to hear. "I could break your arm in 1 second, but I don't want to. I don't need to." The confidence in her words didn't come from proving anything. It came from a complete understanding of her own ability. Blake felt it chillingly deep in his bones. For the first time in his life, he couldn't control the situation with force, with words, with family power, or societal privilege. He was entirely beneath her. His cheeks burned with shame. His heart raced uncontrollably. The eyes around him began to weigh heavier. Someone pulled out a phone. A girl whispered. She made him say, "Please?" Blake swallowed hard, the seconds dragging on like an eternity. He clenched his jaw, his lips so tight they bled. But in the end he knew he had no choice. His voice came out, barely audible. "Please." And immediately Madison released her hold and stood up. Gently, slowly. No curses, no threats. She bent down, picked up the pendant from his trembling palm, the very thing he had snatched and mocked, and placed it back around her neck. She didn't look at him again, she didn't look around, she simply walked away, slowly, as if finishing a routine workout. Blake remained on the floor. No one laughed. No one helped him stand. Everything had changed. It was no longer a world where he stood on a pedestal. And he knew, deep within his mind, that in those 10 seconds he had gone from a ruler to a fallen man. No strikes, no threats, just calm, precision, and a single timely sentence. "I told you, don't touch me." The words that escaped Blake Radcliffe's throat were not voluntary, nor were they a sign of regret. They were a misstep in the power structure he had once held so tightly. A whisper that felt like a block of concrete pressing down on his chest, forcing out words he had never had to say to anyone in his 17 years of life. "Please." And when Madison released her hold, not in haste, not as if she had won, but as if she simply felt it was enough, Blake's entire world began to crack. He slowly sat up, the physical pain fading into the humiliation that flared like an ember deep in his bones. But Madison was no longer there to continue the confrontation. She had turned her back and walked away, as if no confrontation had ever occurred, no audience, no victory speeches. And it was that very thing that made Blake unable to bear it. Because he, the one who was used to controlling every gaze, forcing others to keep their eyes at his feet, now had to face the truth. He had been defeated, not by an equal opponent, but by someone he had once considered invisible. Blake tried to stand. His back ached from the fall, his palms scraped from the ground, but he couldn't take his eyes off the hallway where Madison had disappeared. The eyes around him were still there, and this time no one was hiding them. No more mocking laughter, no more pitying glances, just the heavy silence he had never had to endure before. The silence he had once cast upon others, now tightening around his throat. A few students were still watching. No one said a word, no one helped him up. In their eyes, Blake was no longer the untouchable one. He had been touched, and not by a weapon, but by willpower. In that moment he felt exposed. The layers he had once draped over himself, the polished exterior, the family name, the superior physique, the sharp words, could no longer hide the truth. He had been subdued by 3 simple words. Please. And Madison didn't ask for more. She didn't make him apologize publicly. She didn't boast about her victory. She didn't make him kneel as he had done to others. She only wanted the confirmation that he no longer stood above her, and for someone like Blake, that was the most brutal form of punishment. He walked away from the hallway, his heart still pounding in his chest like war drums inside him. His hands clenched tightly, nails digging into his palms. He couldn't feel the physical pain. All he could feel was the shredded pride burning in his chest. He couldn't understand. He, who had never let anyone surpass him, who had never been humiliated, had been defeated by a girl who spoke fewer than 3 sentences each day. He passed by his close friends, still standing frozen in the corner of the hallway, their eyes cloudy, unable to look him in the face. Tyler furrowed his brow, about to ask, "Are you okay?" But Blake waved him off, his eyes shooting flames. He didn't want pity. He didn't want anyone defending him, because that would only make him more pathetic. What drove him mad wasn't that Madison had struck him, but how she had struck him. She hadn't attacked him like an enemy. She hadn't screamed like the others he had humiliated before. She just acted, as if she had done this 100 times before, as if he was just another trivial test she was already familiar with. And what was even more terrifying, she had spared him. That wasn't mercy. That was a statement. I could, but I choose not to, because you are not worth it. Blake had never been spared, because he had never allowed anyone the chance to turn the tables. But today, the girl he had once considered inferior, contemptible, even unworthy of a name, had stepped out of her silence and put him down on the floor without shedding a drop of blood. And the bitterest truth? Even if he wanted to, he couldn't retaliate. He no longer had any tools effective enough, because his power, the one nurtured by fear, had lost its potency. His old tricks wouldn't make Madison fear. His old words wouldn't shake her. He had been defeated in a battle where he thought he was the only one wielding weapons. That night, Blake lay in bed, the dim light of the room casting shadows on the ceiling. All the messages, calls, notifications, he let them sit in silence. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, but what he saw was Madison's composed face, the gaze that held no ripple, the voice that didn't need to rise to make him bow his head. And that night Blake Radcliffe, the one who had thought he was invincible, realized for the first time, some people don't need power to make the ruler kneel. All it takes is awareness, a single precise touch, and an unexpected sentence, enough to rewrite the entire game. The rumors spread faster than any video footage recorded that afternoon. Within less than one class period after the incident in the second-floor hallway, the name Madison Carter began to appear in every student chat group at Ridgeway, from the underground Facebook group, Ridgeway Confessions, to private message threads in senior students' friend circles, and even a few cryptic status updates on Snapchat. The king has been dethroned. Never touch her necklace. Trust me. 10 seconds. End of game. At first, many didn't believe it. How could it be? How could a quiet girl, one who didn't play sports, wasn't involved in any groups, and barely ever spoke in class, possibly bring down Blake Radcliffe? The guy who had single-handedly taken down 2 tough opponents on the football field? The guy who any freshman had to press against the wall when he passed by? Probably just exaggerated. Blake must have slipped. An accident, it can't be real. Until the first video appeared. A student, seemingly from the far corner of the hallway, had managed to capture the end of the incident. While it didn't catch the entire sequence of movements, the footage clearly showed Blake Radcliffe, crashing to the floor, his arm twisted, unable to fight back, and begging, "Please." That moment, lasting only 3 seconds, was enough to etch itself into the memory of the entire school like an earthquake. The boy who had once embodied power was suddenly the prey, and the hunter was none other than the quiet black girl everyone thought was invisible. The wave of realization broke when a student, Malik Johnson, a member of the wrestling team, spoke up during lunch, his voice low, still shocked. "I know that girl. Madison Carter. She was the Illinois Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu state champion. I've seen the video of her taking down a coach weighing almost 200 pounds in less than 15 seconds. No way. Do you have the video? Are you kidding?" Malik didn't say more. He simply pulled out his phone and opened a saved YouTube link. And then, on the screen, amidst the harsh light of a cramped wrestling room, Madison appeared. Her hair braided neatly at the back of her head, her focus almost ruthless, as she faced off against a male coach, a man twice her size. The match didn't last long. In under 15 seconds, she brought him down with a series of fluid, flawless moves, a chokehold, a hip spin, an absolutely precise leg sweep that forced the man to tap out in the middle of the mat in front of hundreds of onlookers. No one said anything when the video ended. No one laughed. No more doubts. No more denial. Madison Carter wasn't some lucky girl who fought back in a moment of impulse. She was a trained fighter and chose to remain silent. The truth crashed through, and with it, a wave of questions came pouring from the mouths of those who had once ignored her. Why did she hide this? Why didn't she compete for the school? How come no one knew her dad was who he is? Then, a student in the U.S. history class, where Madison had once given a short presentation on the civil rights movement, spoke up. She mentioned her grandmother's name was Ruby Carter. I think she was involved in the fight against school violence in the 60s. A few people Googled. And then, the black and white image of Ruby L. Carter appeared, a woman with a determined gaze, dragged off a chair by police during a nonviolent protest in Chicago in 1963. Underneath the image was a caption, Ruby L. Carter, the pioneer of the anti-punishment law for black students in Cook County. The story pieced together. And Madison, the girl who had once been a shadow, was now a symbol of power that didn't need noise. She didn't want admiration. She had never sought the spotlight. But it was her silence, her restraint, and her decision to strike at the right moment. That made her an obsession no bully could erase. Blake Radcliffe knew that better than anyone. Because now, it wasn't just about him being defeated. It was about the entire school witnessing a fundamental shift in perception. The one who talks the most isn't the strongest. The one with the principal as their father isn't the one in charge. It's the one who controls their anger. The one who waits for the right moment. And when they act, just once, to make the world go quiet. And Blake, once the one who made the entire school go silent out of fear, was now drowning in the silence with no power to control it. When Blake Radcliffe struggled to rise from the cold tile of the second-floor hallway, it wasn't the pain in his wrist or the swelling at his side that caused him to falter, but the sudden, cruel shift in the gazes of those around him. The crowd of students hadn't left. They stood still, not stepping forward to help, not offering any questions, not hiding their expressions as they usually did. Instead, they looked at Blake as if he were a statue that had toppled in the middle of the square, both stunned and satisfied. No more admiring gazes. No more the tilted smiles of admiration every time he walked into the schoolyard. Now, in their silent, heavy looks, there was everything. The surprise of those who had never seen their idol fall. The disappointment of those who had idolized him wrongly, and worst of all, the mockery from those who had once been too afraid to even look him in the eye. Blake swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for something to lean on, a justification, anything to help him regain his breath and, if possible, the authority that had slipped from his grasp. But all he was met with was silence. A kind of silence he couldn't control, and that terrified him. For the first time in his life, Blake felt small. That feeling didn't come from the physical pain, but from something deeper, a crack that spread from the very place where he had built his ego like a fortress. His whole life had been about making others shrink in fear. The sharp, biting words, the blocks in the hallway, the jokes about race, gender, and background. He had perfected the art of domination through words and presence. But today, standing in front of Madison's composure, the girl he had once barely bothered to remember, he realized that power had never been real. It had been an illusion, a throne built on sand, and with a single touch, not a sword swing, not a loud shout, everything had crumbled. None of his close friends spoke up. Tyler was still nearby, but didn't dare approach. Sean, who usually laughed loudly when Blake mocked someone, now kept his head down, glued to his phone. The group that had followed him like satellites around the sun now scattered as if afraid of the flame that had just erupted from an explosion they themselves had contributed to. Blake clenched his fists, his anger flaring as a reflex, but it couldn't explode, because he instinctively understood. If he continued, if he laid a hand on Madison again, next time, she wouldn't stop at a fall. He turned his back, walking away in quiet panic, his heart pounding like war drums, trying to maintain his calm on a face burning with shame. His steps were heavy like lead, no longer with the force of a ruler. He didn't dare look back. Step by step, he passed the faces of the students he had once controlled like puppets. Each one was a mirror reflecting the truth. He was no longer the center of this hallway, no longer the one who decided the rules. What was worse, Madison didn't need to take his place as the center. She didn't seek a crown. She didn't seize a throne. She just did what needed to be done, and then walked away. And that's why she became unshakable. Blake entered the boys' bathroom, slamming the door into the wall, his eyes red with suppressed anger. He looked at himself in the mirror. Messy hair, wrinkled shirt, stains on his sleeve, a slight bruise on his left cheek. But what he couldn't bear was the reflection in the mirror. His eyes no longer confident, no longer arrogant. Just a teenage boy, confused, not understanding why he no longer mattered. He punched the wall, once, then twice. But nothing changed, because what needed to be fixed wasn't the mirror. It was an ego that had lived too long in a bubble of privilege. When Blake left the bathroom, the hallway was almost empty. Only a few students walked by, glancing at him without stopping. No one greeted him. No one looked up. It was as if he were just an ordinary student. No one to fear, no one important. And that was the harshest punishment. To be forgotten. That day, no one needed to punish Blake with records, discipline, or moral lessons. No cameras, no teachers intervening. Because Madison Carter, with just 10 seconds and 3 words, had taught him a lesson that no one in his life before had ever taught. True power doesn't come from making others fear you. It comes from making the strong look at themselves and fear what they see. And ironically, as Madison Carter walked away without a word, without looking back, without claiming victory, it was her silence that rang out like the death knell for Blake Radcliffe's decaying ego. The silver necklace was tucked safely in Madison's jacket pocket, like a trophy reclaimed after a battle where the victor didn't need medals, applause, or a victory declaration. Each step she took as she left the hallway left behind a space void of sound, and the rest of Ridgway's world could only watch, too afraid to speak. Blake, meanwhile, still stood there, his back stiff, his hands hanging limply, his eyes clouded with confusion, not knowing where to look. His whole life had been about shouting commands, pushing others into a position where they had to explain themselves. But now there was no one to blame, no one to strike, nothing to cling to. The silence, the very weapon he had once mocked when he saw Madison use it to avoid confrontation, now returned like a blade, pressing into his throat. A completely different kind of silence, heavy, suffocating, stripping away all pretensions. It wasn't the quiet in the empty hallway, but the quiet in his mind. It was the need to face a gaze that no longer held respect. It was when every person walked past him as though he had never existed as the strongest one. At Ridgway, reputation doesn't die with a punch. It dies with the silence that follows, when no one speaks your name anymore, when no one is afraid, when no one is cautious. You're simply left behind. That afternoon, Blake didn't return to class. He hid in the equipment room at the stadium, a place where he had once gathered with his friends after football practice, where crude jokes had been the entertainment, and where any lower-class student who walked in by mistake would immediately have to apologize. But now, the place was empty, just him. He leaned back against the wall, the last rays of the day casting a slanted light through the window, coloring half of his face, his jaw slightly swollen. He opened his phone and scrolled through social media. His name was still there, but no longer as the one who instilled fear. Now, he was the center of a viral defeat, replayed and shared hundreds of times. The clip, "Black Girl Locks Radcliffe's Arm," had almost 10,000 views in just 3 hours. Most of the comments were filled with surprise, mockery, and more than a few praises for Madison. She didn't need to shout, she just had to strike once. Please, I've never heard that from Blake before. If I were him, I'd quit school. A true warrior. Blake tossed his phone onto the floor, the sound of it breaking, piercing the stillness. But it didn't release anything. The knot of frustration still sat heavy in his chest like a sinking stone. He had thought being beaten by Madison was the worst part. But no, what truly terrified him was that she didn't even see him as an enemy. She didn't curse. She didn't threaten. She didn't wait for him to apologize or make things right. She just walked away, as though he had already been dealt with, one task finished, with no emotion, no attachment. Madison didn't want him to become better. She didn't need him to realize anything. She didn't want him to change. And that's what made her silence the most terrifying, because without expectation, without asking for forgiveness, it meant he had no chance left. That evening, when Blake got home, everything was still familiar. The neatly trimmed lawn, his mom's SUV parked in the garage, the warm yellow light from the kitchen spilling through the glass window. But inside him, a vast emptiness was forming, and it couldn't be filled with a hot meal or his mom's indifferent questions. He ate in silence, and for the first time, the silence wasn't something he imposed on others. It was something that was being imposed on him. In the quiet room on the second floor, Blake Radcliffe sat on his bed, the light from his phone now off, only the ticking of the wall clock filling the room. In his mind, one image repeated over and over: Madison's gaze, calm, resolute, needing no victory, because she knew she had already won the moment he touched that necklace. And he knew that silence would follow him forever, not as a curse, but as a truth from which he could never turn back. And perhaps the most astonishing thing about the entire event that day was this: no one was seriously hurt, no blood was spilled, no teacher walked in at the right moment, no calls for parents, and no suspensions. Everything unfolded in an open space, under the light of the afternoon, with a few dozen silent witnesses. There were no screams, no riots, no accusations, but none of that was necessary, because all the students present that day understood, deep in their hearts, that the power at Ridgeway had shifted. No announcements, no rankings, no acknowledgement from the administration, but everyone knew. The one in power was no longer Blake Radcliffe, the tall white guy, the principal's son, who once laughed at those beneath him, just because they didn't wear the same brand of shoes or didn't know when to bow their heads. The true power now rested with the one who didn't need to speak, didn't need to build an image, didn't need a following, but was simply the girl who once walked quietly like a shadow through the halls, Madison Carter. The paradox, and the true nature of justice, is that it doesn't always come with rules. It doesn't need the principal's signature, nor does it stem from empty moral lessons hung in classrooms. Sometimes justice is revealed in the most unexpected moments, in places that seem meaningless through actions so simple yet surprising. A calm gaze, a straightforward word, a fall at just the right moment, and one final sentence: please. That's all. Blake Radcliffe wasn't punished with a report, a warning, or moral lessons, but in the invisible order among the students, where every look, every whisper, every rumor is more powerful than any loudspeaker, he had been judged. No one made way for him when he walked into class. No one laughed when he cracked a joke at someone's expense. Some of his old friends still tried to maintain a friendly distance, more out of habit than trust, but even the "Hey, did you hit the gym yesterday?" now felt curt, forced, as though they weren't sure how to treat him anymore. Because what was broken no longer resonated the same. On the other hand, Madison didn't say anything about the events of that day, no status updates, no boasting. Even when someone asked her, she just smiled lightly. "I just wanted to get my stuff back." That simple statement, so hard to believe, spread through the school like a small fire, burning away every exaggerated script the students had used to glorify a hero. She didn't need to be called a hero. She didn't need anyone to stand by her. It was her calmness, her indifference to glory, that made Madison Carter a name no one dared underestimate anymore. In an English class, when the teacher invited her to read her essay on the power of silence, Madison stood up, holding a neatly folded piece of paper. She didn't look at Blake, the boy sitting 3 desks away, eyes downcast, but every word she spoke fell into the classroom like pebbles touching the surface of a pond, creating deep ripples. I believe silence can be the most powerful form of resistance. Not because people have nothing to say, but because they choose not to waste words on those who aren't worth listening to. And when the time comes, if action is necessary, that action won't need to be explained. She didn't need to name anyone. She didn't need to recount any stories, but everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. And the first person to bow their head was Blake. Because he knew this wasn't a victory, this was a conclusion. In the harsh, unforgiving ecosystem of an elite high school, where every name, every look could determine social status, Madison had claimed an irreplaceable position. Not through force, not through tricks, but through composure. The kind of composure built on silence, patience, and accumulated from every moment of being overlooked without breaking. And perhaps what people would remember most about Madison Carter wasn't the takedown of a big guy in the hallway, but the image of her afterward, retying the necklace around her neck, zipping up her jacket, turning to walk away amidst the crowd, quietly, decisively, and without needing anyone to watch. Because true justice doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to show up at the right moment, and then walk away quietly, leaving behind a world that has been forever changed. And when the morning sun quietly entered the Ridgeway campus the next day, accompanied by a gentle autumn breeze sweeping through the gray-tiled hallways, once the stage for schoolyard power games, the first thing that struck anyone was not the usual bustle of a new day, but a strange atmosphere, silence, awkwardness, and a suffocating heaviness in the air. Blake Radcliffe entered the school through the side gate, something he had never done before. There were no longer long strides, no cheerful, "Hey, Blake," from scattered groups of friends around the courtyard. No more crowds parting automatically when he walked through. No more loud laughter drowning out the bell for class. Only furtive glances followed him, quickly turning away. Some pretended to focus on their phones. Others nodded casually before retreating. Even those faces who once followed him like satellites, Tyler, Sean, even Marcus from the football team, avoided his gaze as if they had touched an unhealed wound. No one spoke a word. But they all understood without saying anything. Blake was no longer the king of the hallways. There was no official decree. No one had taken his throne. But the position was now vacant, because the one who once held it had pulled himself down, with a single taunt, a careless yank of the arm, but carrying all the arrogance, ignorance, and prejudice he had accumulated over the years. That taunt, an antique ornament, or a relic from slave ancestors, was meant to be just another sharp joke, as it had been many times before. But this time, it touched something Blake could not foresee, the inherited pride of generations, and Madison, with all her patience, chose not to respond with a punch, but with a lesson that could never be erased. He walked through hallway B, where just yesterday he had been knocked to the ground. Though the floor was clean, the dust wiped away, and the witnesses from yesterday might no longer gather here, the space itself, still remembered, as though this place held the echoes of an event that had forever altered the social structure of Ridgeway. And Madison? She arrived 20 minutes later than him. No fanfare, no change. Still the neatly braided hair, the simple hoodie, the slung backpack, and the gaze that didn't require anyone's attention. But today, all eyes were on her, Not the scrutinizing eyes from before. Not pity or prejudice, but a different kind of silence, one that took the form of respect. When Madison passed by Hallway B, where Blake still stood silently by his locker, a group of third-year students automatically parted to let her through. No one said anything. No one touched her. And in that moment there was no clearer sensation. The gravitational center of this school had shifted. Blake saw it all. He saw the eyes of those who once regarded him with respect, now turned toward Madison. Not in fear, but in admiration. Admiration because she didn't need to compete, didn't need to speak loudly, didn't need to disguise herself as anyone else. And the truth that sent a chill down his spine was he could never regain that, because it had never truly belonged to him in the first place. In class, things proceeded as usual. The teacher took attendance, lectured, and students took notes. But every time Blake moved, every gesture was suffocated by the shadow of what had happened the day before. Each time he heard a chuckle in the corner of the room, he immediately thought of Madison, thought of the video, thought of her gaze, thought of the feeling of humiliation he had never experienced before. He tried to glance at her a few times during the lesson, but Madison didn't look back. She didn't need to. And that very fact made him unbearable. Being ignored was a weapon he had used against others. But now, when it was returned, calmly, without hostility, without intent, it ravaged him like a slow, persistent flood. At lunchtime, Blake's table was empty. Sean claimed he had a test. Tyler sat with another group. Marcus said he had to leave early. Only Blake remained, with a tray of cold food, uneven chopsticks, and the murmurs from the table behind. Did you see the clip of Madison talking about the power of silence? It's even stronger than when she took down Blake. Yeah, she's definitely the type of person who doesn't need to raise her voice to make the world listen. He heard every word. He didn't take another bite. And for the first time in his life, Blake Radcliffe placed his tray down and walked out of the cafeteria without anyone telling him to leave. Because he knew the cost of a taunt wasn't retaliation, it was replacement. Not by someone else craving power, but by someone who didn't care for power, yet possessed the strength to make every order bow its head. And Madison Carter was that person. And in the moment when Blake Radcliffe set his tray down on the table and silently left the cafeteria, no one called after him, no one reminded him to come back, and no one, not teachers or classmates, tried to pull him back to the throne he had lost since yesterday. Madison Carter didn't need to do anything more. She simply sat in her usual corner of the library, a place no one had noticed before, where she had spent entire lunch hours sketching, reading, and quietly navigating a world that wasn't meant for her. But today, that seat was no longer the place of the silent black girl. It was the seat of the only person in the school who had rewritten all definitions of power. Madison had never been weak. She just chose not to show herself in loud ways. In a school where the voices of the loudest always drowned out everything else, a place where sharp words were thrown as tools to control the crowd, Madison was the only one who knew how to control her power. She didn't attack when provoked. She didn't scream when insulted. She didn't collapse when isolated. She observed, remembered, waited. And when the moment came, not too soon, not too late, she acted, precisely, decisively. No more than 10 seconds. No need for further explanation. It wasn't the power of a fist. It was the power of someone who understood their worth and wouldn't let anyone, even a principal's son, touch the most sacred part of their identity. The necklace Blake had torn from Madison's neck was not just jewelry. It was a symbol, a continuation of a legacy she carried with her every day, the legacy of her grandmother, of the black women who had once stood in much colder hallways, pushed down, ignored, humiliated, but still walked on. And today, Madison had continued that journey, not with a call for attention, but with a proud existence that needed no permission. And Blake? He learned his lesson in the most painful way. No one forced him to apologize. No one made him kneel. But he did kneel in his heart when he was compelled to utter the word "please" in front of the person he had once seen as invisible. It only took 10 seconds. But in those 10 seconds he lost everything: his reputation, his power, his respect, and all the long-held illusions about who he was in this world. He had once thought a girl like Madison was someone he could define by her skin color, her background, her silence. But now, every time he closed his eyes, what appeared before him wasn't her anger. It was the expressionless gaze, but one that saw through all the emptiness within him. No one at Ridgeway dared laugh at Madison anymore. No one called her the Shadow. And if anyone asked, "Who is she?" Zrenia. There was no need for anyone to answer. The whole school knew. And the name Madison Carter would remain long after she graduated, as a clear testament that power doesn't need to be loud to become legendary. As for Blake, maybe he would recover. Maybe one day he would find his way. But the scar in his mind, the humiliation, the loss of control, the shame that could not be justified, would always remind him that there was once a person who didn't need to shout, didn't need to seem terrifying, only needed to stand up at the right moment, and made the whole world around her go silent. Never judge a quiet black girl through white eyes and prejudice. That's the last mistake you can ever make. Because silence is not a sign of weakness. It is the shell of a strength that, when revealed, can cause everything you once believed in to collapse in the blink of an eye. And this is the story of Madison Carter, the quiet black girl who made an entire system of privilege fall silent, not with a scream, not with a fist, but with poise and absolute control. She didn't need to prove she was strong. She just needed one moment, and the world around her changed forever. What about you? If you were Madison in this story, how would you act when pushed to your final limit? If this story made you think, don't forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to not miss the next inspiring justice stories. We'll be back with more powerful, deep, and unforgettable stories.